Chapter 2. On the day of my departure, I squeezed down the aisle of an airplane, trying not to knock anyone in the head with my duffel bag. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said to a middle-aged American woman seated in the aisle. "Can I get to my window seat?" She jerked her head up and frowned, and I could hear her thinking, "Find another seat." I certainly preferred to do so, but the plane was full, and the passengers in the aisle behind me were impatient. I carefully squeezed past her to reach my assigned place. From beneath her bouffant, she glowered at my long hair. I chose to keep my attention out the window. Minutes later, I peeked from the corner of my eye only to be jolted by her unrelenting stare. A delay was announced. It was going to be a long flight. Time passed, and again I peeked sideways. But this time, instead of the lady with the bouffant hairdo, I saw a fascinating figure in black jeans, black boots, and a black sleeveless t-shirt. Silver bracelets circled his fair, thin arms. His long, straight hair was white as snow, as was his skin. His eyes were an albino pink, but his mischievous smile filled me with joy. This man looked so uncommon, yet so familiar. I had seen him before. Yes, he was a legendary rock and roll star, one of my favorites, Johnny Winter. "What's happening, brother? I'm Johnny. They call me Little Monk." He greeted me with the Soul Brothers handshake. "How did you get to the seat?" I asked him. "Someone else was here a minute ago." Johnny chuckled, and in his trademark Texan drawl replied, "Man, was that woman sitting next to you uptight. She came storming down the aisle and brewed up a big old hassle, demanding another seat. She don't like our kind, Little Monk, but you know, that's all right. The stewardess swapped my seat to keep us brothers together." We had plenty of time to talk. I shared with him my spiritual longing, and he shared with me candid stories of his life. I told him that I had recently seen a great show of his in Florida with Janis Joplin. His slender body rocked with laughter. Never was there a wilder, crazier woman on either side of the Mississippi River, he said. Janis was confused, lusty, and stoned out, but a good kid. She was, he said, like a sister to him, but he worried for her. Little Janis is burning her candle from both ends. I don't know how long she'll last. Waxing serious, his pinkish eyes gazed into mine. "You know, Little Monk, money and fame can destroy people. Say a little prayer for her." As the engine roared, we zoomed down the runway and soared into the sky. Our hearts seemed to fly as we talked of the great blues legends from Chicago and the Mississippi Delta. Johnny was supercharged on this topic. "Soul brother, we can go on rapping forever. I ain't gonna sweat if this old plane never lands." Suddenly he noticed the harmonica attached to my belt and shouted, "You play the harp? Let's jam, man." In an instant, he had his harmonica in his hand. "Pick a song." "Do you know Mother-in-Law Blues by Little Junior Parker?" I asked. "Right on, man, right on." His thumb shot up. 30,000 feet in the sky, and to my great amazement, the famous Johnny Winter began to perform, with me as his partner. Older people stared in condemnation, while younger passengers smiled gleefully. The young airline hostesses, too, swayed in the aisle to a free concert. Absorbed in the blues, Johnny and I were oblivious. The plane landed at JFK in New York, and Johnny and I strolled into the terminal. At the gate, a beautiful Danish model was waiting for Johnny. Onlookers marveled. Thrilled to see me with Johnny Winter, Frank and Gary were impressed with my good luck. Gary stroked his wavy beard and beamed. "Hey, Monk," he joked, pointing at Johnny's girl, "don't you wish she was waiting for you instead of us?" "Tonight," I replied, shaking their hands, "we'll begin our spiritual quest. I think I'll be less distracted with you guys." We arrived in Europe. On our first night in Luxembourg, we slept in the campground. Crammed into a single tent, the three of us lay in our sleeping bags full of anticipation for what the next day would bring. Finally, roosters crowed the arrival of dawn. Jumping out of the tent into the crisp morning air, Gary and I stretched, savoring our good fortune and breathing in the fragrance of evergreens and flowering trees. Suddenly, a shriek rang out. "No, God damn it, no!" Frank emerged from the tent, pale and tormented. "I've been robbed. All my money gone." Gary and I scrambled into the tent, searching everywhere. Frank had already given up. "I've searched. There's no use." Gary placed his palm on Frank's shoulder and whispered, "It's all right, brother. We'll take care of you." "Whatever we have is yours, Frank," I consoled him. "We don't need money. We have each other." Frank cast his head down, shook it back and forth, and announced that there was no way we could make it with what we had left. He was going home immediately. "You guys coming?" I had less than $20 of my own. Still, Gary's eyes met mine, and I silently transmitted my resolve to stay. He agreed, and we bid Frank, who spent only one night in Europe, a sad goodbye. As Frank slung his backpack over his shoulder and paced away back to the security of home, Gary and I pondered the mysteries that awaited us. Later that day, I found a creek to sit beside. The high trees danced in the wind, and the water flowed effortlessly. With Frank gone, I had almost nothing, but strangely, I felt free. Quick enough, Gary and I were invited to breakfast with some hippies from Holland. After sharing their muesli with us, Cosmas and Gush offered us a ride to the Netherlands. Soon we were cruising through the countryside of Belgium and Holland in their Volkswagen van, gazing out our open windows at vast fields carpeted with hundreds and thousands of red, yellow, white, pink, and violet tulips, all in perfect rows, blooming in the sunshine as the cassette player boomed out Donovan, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones. After a stop in Apkoude, the idyllic home of one of our new friends, we arrived in Amsterdam, where we were led to an abandoned warehouse where dozens of hippies sprawled on the floor freely smoking marijuana. The lights were dim, rats scampered here and there. A shaggy band played on an improvised stage of rotting plywood stretched across milk crates. With hashish pipe in hand and a wild grin, Kush blurted, "I'll see you guys, maybe on my pilgrimage to Haight-Ashbury, the Mecca for hippies." Then he waved goodbye and disappeared into the smoke. In the days that followed, Gary and I learned to survive with practically no money at all. Early in the morning, we'd spend a few cents on a loaf of bread hot out of the baker's oven. Under a tree, we cut the loaf in half and relished it as our subsistence for the day. This shared loaf of dry bread was to become our daily diet wherever we traveled. On special occasions, we managed to procure a hunk of cheese, too. We usually slept either as guests in the homes of people we met, under trees, inside abandoned buildings, or in public crash pads. What little money we had, we tried to stretch for as long as possible. The European counterculture flocked to Amsterdam. Dam Square was the social center. Hundreds of seekers congregated in venues like Fantasio, Paradiso, and Melkweg to hang out and hear music. Another popular place was Cosmos, a spiritual nightclub. It was there one night that I met a tall American with partly shaved head, ponytail, and white robes. "Do you want some spiritual food?" he inquired. I nodded meekly. "Cup your hands." When I did, he dumped a huge ladle of fruit salad mixed with runny yogurt into them. As the concoction dripped down my arms, I stood there perplexed. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Eat it," he laughed, taking his leave. Little did I know that destiny would have us meet again, thousands of miles away, in a setting beyond my wildest imagination. Gary and I were making friends from the world over, but pleasant as it was, I was distracted. Something I could not comprehend was calling me. I found myself retreating to museums to contemplate religious art, or to Vondel Park to meditate and study spiritual books. But my favorite place was sitting over a canal. While the city might rage with a passion for power, wealth, and a multitude of pleasures, and while fashions and fads change like the seasons, the cool water of the canals seemed at total peace as it flowed through it all. I would sit for hours watching the water, wondering where the current of my life was leading me. We continued our expedition, using a little bit of the money we had saved for boat fares. We hitchhiked to the Hook of Holland and took a huge ferry across the English Channel to the United Kingdom. Gray clouds discharged a misty drizzle. The ship surrendered to the movement of the waves below, slowly moving up and down. As we lunged forward, cutting into the choppy sea, I mused on where I was heading. At 19, I ought to be preparing for a career, but I had no inclination to do so. Where was I going? Why couldn't I focus seriously on anything besides the ideals that filled my head? I had a vague concept of spirituality, but no hint of my future. I spotted a row of life preservers fastened to the side of the ferry and prayed to be thrown such a life preserver to rescue me from a sea of uncertainties. If a person does not have an ideal he's ready to die for, I recalled, he has nothing meaningful to live for. I left my homeland in search of that ideal, but I was like a leaf careening in the wind, not knowing where I was going. Suddenly, the stunning white cliffs of Dover appeared from behind a cloud of fog. The ferry soon docked at the coast, and we were funneled through British immigration. The officials stared at us with suspicion. Gary was about 5'8" and lean, his flowing brown hair, beard, and striking face evoking the frequent comment that he resembled Jesus Christ. He wore blue jeans, a green t-shirt, and canvas shoes. A raggedy old U.S. Army surplus backpack and sleeping bag were strapped to his shoulders. As for me, despite my long hair, my childish face could not for the life of it grow a mustache or beard. I wore gray pinstripe jeans, a gray turtleneck, and a black vest. For those who knew me, this simple black vest had become my trademark. I wore it every day for well over a year. A faded brown duffel bag and sleeping bag were slung over my shoulder, and moccasins covered my feet. Standing in line, we were the targets of unsavory stares and comments by government officials. When we reached the desk, we meekly held out our U.S. passports, only to be pulled into a room. Minutes later, 2 customs officials and a bobby entered, staring us down. The leader wore a gray suit and brown tie. He commanded, "Search them for drugs." Dumping the contents of my bag on the table, the officer found nothing but one green T-shirt, a pair of underpants, a toothbrush, hairbrush, a bar of soap, the Bible, and the little pamphlet from Randall's Island. The man grimaced. "That's all you have?" Timidly I responded, "That's it, sir. Besides this," I held out my harmonica. Gary, too, was searched. Then came the loaded question. "How much money are you carrying?" When we showed them our meager funds, their disgust turned to wrath. The leader's face reddened. "We don't need animals like you in our country," he spewed. "We'll cut off all your bloody hair and throw you in jail." Turning to a bobby, he ordered, "Get the scissors and cut their hair to the scalp." They then stripped us of all clothes and scrutinized every inch of our belongings. Next, they launched into a long interrogation that seared our minds. Finally, with the words, "You're in big trouble," they stormed out of the room. Anxiety-stricken, Gary and I could not speak a word. We passed an hour in isolation, anxiously awaiting word of our fates. Eventually, 2 bobbies flung open the doors, grabbed us by the arms, and drove us down a corridor. When we reached the customs, they shoved us through the gate with the words, "One wrong move and you're in jail." They stamped our passports, and we were free. Still shaken, we found ourselves on the roadside, grateful for the beauty of the English countryside, our thumbs out. A car stopped and we jumped in. A young girl and her boyfriend smiled while their Scottish terrier leaped on our legs. "Where are you going?" the girl asked. "We're not sure," Gary answered. The boy swigged from a bottle of beer and said, "We're traveling ahead to a rock festival at the Isle of Wight. It will be a jolly good time. Would you like to join us, mates?" Gary and I smiled in agreement, and we were off, the barking terrier licking at our faces. We crossed by ferry to the island and were soon cast into the swarming multitude of the counterculture. The enormous gathering was set amid green hills and valleys. At the fences, angry police with attack dogs battled against ticketless pilgrims as the bands played on. 3 days and nights of sensational performances were in full swing. Marijuana smoke filled the air, and people were dropping acid left and right. Men and women slid together down the hillsides in the mud, and more half-naked bodies writhed in the time to the music. One night, while rains poured out of the sky, Gary and I were not far from the stage when Jimi Hendrix came on to perform. He wore an orange velvet suit with flowing sleeves, but seemed otherwise quite subdued. Gone was the guitar-burning showman I'd seen before. Tonight, he was very much the serious musician. He played his warped, woofing version of the Star-Spangled Banner. Here was one of the icons of my generation, a prophet of the counterculture, delivering a message of freedom to express oneself without taboos, of rebellion against the establishment. To my mind, the message was to follow my heart, regardless of popular opinion. The music was thunderous and seemed to shake the hills, stir the sea, and scatter the clouds. But the silent call within me, one I couldn't yet name, seemed louder still. After the concert, Gary and I were picked up by a van packed with rowdy travelers headed for London. Seeking refuge, I looked through my bag and picked out the pamphlet the strange monk on Randall's Island had given me. On the back cover was a photograph of a man sitting under a tree. His large, almond-shaped eyes appeared to be glistening with ecstasy. Although he was very old, his expression shone with the innocence of a child. He was dressed in a turtleneck, and his smile radiated peace. I did not know who he was or even where he was from, but I was struck. If anyone in this creation has spiritual bliss, I thought, it's this person. Sometime later, we were staying in a small apartment in a suburb of London with some brothers we'd met at the Isle of Wight. One of the brothers was reading the newspaper. His face turned pale, and he looked up and groaned aloud. "What is it?" we asked him. "I've got bloody bad news for you, mates. Jimi Hendrix is dead." "No. What happened?" I asked. Our host placed the newspaper down as if in slow motion. "The London paper says that last night he overdosed on sleeping pills and choked on his vomit." Gary dropped his head into his hands. I felt as if the wind had been knocked out of me. What should I learn from this, I asked myself. Hendrix had everything the world craves, and at such a young age. Wealth, fame, and amazing talent. But he was dissatisfied. This idol for our generation became a victim of his own excesses. Thousands were proclaiming sex, drugs, and rock and roll as the progressive way to live. Freedom was the highest value. But were they really free? I thought of the wonderful people I'd met who were part of the counterculture, but also of those who seemed merely wild and ungrateful. I thought of how gratitude had been the most important value my mother and father had taught my brothers and me. Did I really want to be a part of all of this? I certainly did not fit in with my parents' generation. Where would I fit in? Please, God, show me. With these thoughts, I offered a prayer for Jimmy. I was already beginning to feel disillusioned with the movement that I had rejected social and family norms to join. I'd once had a dream that the counterculture would create an enlightened world, but now I felt that the more destructive elements of the movement, such as rebellion for rebellion's sake and for the sake of personal pleasure, had won out. With the useless, tragic death of Jimi Hendrix, my dream had all but died. Still, like a man on the verge of death may struggle for one last chance to survive, I was about to dive into the excesses of my generation like never before. In London, Gary and I explored Piccadilly Circus, among acid heads, potheads, and seekers of peace, all dressed in flamboyant attire. Hippies rapped, drug pushers and prostitutes solicited, bobbies scrutinized, skinheads growled, and tourists snapped photos of the bizarre scene. On Lambeth Road across the river from the British Parliament, we met a Catholic priest who sympathized with young travelers. Each night at 9, he opened the stone basement of his church for young people to sleep on the floor for free. We had to leave at 9 in the morning, and nothing was provided but the cold, hard floor. Still, it was a place to crash, and travelers brought their own sleeping bags. Finding a spot on the floor every night, I maneuvered through this room, packed with unwashed bodies, the air thick with the smell of hashish. When the lights were out, it got very dark. Soon I began to hear the sounds of couples having sex, moaning and rolling around. Sometimes I caught sight of people lighting little candles in the far corners of the room, strapping off their arms and shooting heroin in the candlelight. Affected by this atmosphere, I smoked more hashish and marijuana than ever before, and on the surface began to fit in more with the crowd. But while those around me socialized, I retreated within myself. I often found myself wondering why I was bothering to indulge at all. Often after Gary had gone in to find his sleeping place, I would sit, sometimes for hours, on the bank of the River Thames. The massive sheet of flowing water had a hypnotic effect on my mind, and I would question the life I was leading. I looked up at the relentless hands of Big Ben and wondered if I was just wasting my time. Another part of me felt a dire need to prove myself once and for all, that I could break out of my shyness and just enjoy life like never before. For one thing, here I was, 19, and I had never had a girlfriend. In my shyness, I had always been more comfortable listening to music in my room or hanging out with friends than I was on dates. Many propositions had come to me, but I shied away, fearing I might lose my freedom, or even worse, break a nice girl's heart. But all around me now, other guys were bragging about their sexual conquests. I was sick of being different. I met some girls trying to make the scene and flirted more seriously than ever. Still, my efforts felt empty. A force within me was dragging me away from it all. Battling against that inner force, I was determined to be victorious, to experience firsthand the unrestricted pleasures glorified by society. Was it the Lord in my heart I was fighting? Yes, I silently boasted, and I'm winning the battle. But late at night, when I came back to the river, gazing down into the current, I felt ashamed. I was winning, but I felt lost. One evening, I closed my eyes and sat in silent meditation among a sea of pigeons at Trafalgar Square. Circled by shouting children, chattering tourists, and the honking evening traffic, I felt I was connected to a universe within myself, far more substantial than anything around me. Taking a deep breath, I smiled. My conception of my body seemed to evaporate, and I felt my mind merging into an ocean of peace. By comparison, my attempts at gaining sensual pleasure or overcoming my natural introspection seemed irrelevant. Opening my eyes, I visualized downtown London transfiguring into a beautiful family made up of marble lions, Lord Nelson on his column, and all the pigeons, tourists, businessmen, shoppers, and beggars. I strolled across the street and was given a cup of barley soup and a bread slice from a church charity, which I relished along with the homeless. Then with sincere reverence, I entered the church, St. Martin's of the Fields, where I sat on a wooden pew and absorbed myself in reading the Holy Bible. There, a particular passage struck my heart. Lord Jesus instructed his followers, "Come out from among men and be separate." I pondered this. Why should I waste my life trying to fit in with the social fashions of my peers? Why not try to live on my own terms, and hopefully someday on God's terms? Traveling by ferry across the English Channel, Gary and I disembarked in Calais, France. It was a sunny day with birds warbling in delicately formed trees. Fine grasses in lush pastures yielded to the gentle wind. We relished our freedom. Now we could go wherever we pleased. "Hey, monk, where to next? Your wish is my command." Gary's green eyes glistened with adventure as we stood on the side of a country road in western France. "The world is at your beck and call." From the back pocket of his jeans, he pulled a tattered map of Western Europe and pointed to various places. Morocco, Spain, Paris, Rome, Switzerland, Germany. Where? "Where would you like to go, Gary?" "Everywhere, but in which order? That is the question." Thinking for a moment, I remembered the streams I so often studied and stretched my arms toward the sky. We should surrender our destiny to the will of God. Gary laughed, threw down his backpack, and sat on it. Mimicking my gesture, he responded, "What does that mean?" "What would you like it to mean?" I asked. Gary mockingly joined his palms in prayer. "You spend your days studying scriptures and meditating while I'm hanging out." Again stretching his arms to the sky, he said, "You decide how we should surrender our destiny to the will of God." Plucking a yellow wildflower from the ground, I declared, "Like this." Gary said, "You want us to sit here forever like that flower?" "Look, Gary, from a small seed buried in the dirt, this flower has grown into what it is, a beautiful blossom, basking in the sunshine. How? By surrendering her destiny to the will of God." Gary said, "You win, brother, but how does your fancy poetry translate into a hitchhiker's language?" I smelled the flower and had an idea. Whenever a car stops for us, what are the first words they always ask? You play the role of the driver, and I'll be us. Gary shrugged his shoulders. "Hello, where are you going?" I replied, "Where are you going?" "To Casablanca," he said, pretending to steer a car. I clapped my hands. "Perfect! That's where we are going." Handing him the flower, I asked, "What do you think, Gary? Every time we stand on the side of the road, our destiny will be a mystery to be revealed by the next ride." Leaping up, Gary patted me on the back and exclaimed, "That's it! Wherever our ride is going, that's where we're going." He cast the wildflower into the wind. Days later, after passing through villages and towns, we found ourselves on the outskirts of Paris. As we came closer to the city, we burned with anticipation. The Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, magnificent monuments, palaces, and cafes were only a few miles away. But fate had other plans for us. The first ride we got took us to Geneva, Switzerland, where we were soon meditating at the shore of a placid, crescent-shaped lake. At a youth hostel, we shared a dormitory with about 25 others. One of our roommates, Jim, had recently been honorably discharged from the U.S. Army. Jim had a fascination for books on Eastern mysticism, and we spent hours talking. He was lean, strong, and eager for adventure, having been cooped up in the Army for several years. One day, out of curiosity, Jim asked, "Monk, with the Vietnam War raging, how is it you never got drafted?" I told him how the draft board had accidentally typed the wrong birth date onto my records. Later, when the draft lottery was held and the nation watched, sitting on pins and needles, they pulled out one birth date after another. The early draws were the first to be drafted. My actual birth date came up at the beginning of the draft, but the mistaken one was drawn near the end, and those called later were never called to service. Jim looked out into the sky, rubbed his chin, shook his head, and mused for a minute, then remarked, "Maybe it wasn't the draft board's mistake. Maybe God has other plans for you." Jim invited Gary and me to come with him through Italy on his way to Morocco, and we agreed. Near Genoa, the city of Christopher Columbus, we loaded into his Volkswagen Beetle with all the money he'd accumulated in the military, including electronics he planned to sell for profit in the U.S. Terraced hills gave way to the Mediterranean Sea. Afternoon sunshine played on deep blue waters, and we took a break to swim. When we got back to the Beetle, to Jim's horror, everything inside was gone. We went down to the police station to file a report, and matters got even worse. To our shock, the police, shouting and jabbing their fingers in our faces, shoved us into a prison cell. As the heavy steel door slammed shut, a chill ran up my spine. Their chief approached us. "You have two choices," he barked. "Remain in jail or get out of our town and never return." Of course, we chose the latter. In the darkness of night, a squad car with red lights flashing on the roof escorted us up to the city limits. That was our first day in Italy. We drove until morning when we reached a telegraph office. Jim contacted his comrades in Germany who wired him gas fare to return to his military base. Again, Gary and I were on our own. We stood on the roadside, wondering what was next. "Hey, Monk, do you think we're bad luck? First Frank and now Jim. Whoever tries to help us loses everything." "I don't know, Gary. Maybe there's a reason for all this." Gary looked back down the road from where we came. "Do you really think there's a reason for everything?" "Yes, I believe there must be a beautiful plan behind it all." Gary nodded. "I also believe." With that, we stuck out our thumbs and waited to see what fate had planned for us next.